Light that theme, because it's time for Nerd for 30 podcast, where we talk about nerdy-ish movies for 30-ish minutes. My name is Kevin Bauer, a.k.a. the Critics' Choice, the People's Champ, Tim Keck, still away. So I'm doing this one solo bolo. This is going to be some hero ball from myself, recording a podcast all alone. First time I've ever done this, but I got to carry this weight because our usual Pixar correspondent, my girlfriend Lauren Moore, is currently on the injured list. She's sitting the bench with a sore throat, not ideal for podcasting. So today, I'm going it alone, which is kind of ironic for a movie that is about family and that arguably could be about what Marvel considers the first family, the Fantastic Four. Now, the MCU Fantastic Four movie is coming out today. If you are listening to this on release day of this episode, it's very, very hotly anticipated. This is going to be the fourth attempt to make a Fantastic Four movie for Marvel. And I think they tend to happen on the exact 10-year markers, which is kind of fascinating. The Chris Evans and Johan Grufford and Jessica Alba one was in 2005. Fant Four Stick, a movie that I've called on this pod, the worst movie I've ever seen, was in 2015. And the other one that I'm referring to that you in the audience might not even know about was one directed by B-movie director Roger Corman back in the 1990s, which was so bad that they actually went through great lengths to try to make sure that nobody would ever see it again. So I really hope that one pops up on YouTube at some point because I would love to see just how bad it is. There's a scene where to do Mr. Fantastic's stretching effects, they literally put a sleeve and a glove on a broom. And apparently you can really tell. So would love to see that at some point. All of that considered, I have not seen the new one yet, but I do still think that The Incredibles, the first one from the year 2004, is the best Fantastic Four movie ever made. But let's take a step back to when this first came out, 2004. I remember seeing this and loving it. I remember there being anticipation for this movie, but I remember there also being trepidation for this movie because people were worried that Pixar wouldn't be able to do human characters. The most experience they had with human characters up to that point was in Monsters, Inc. the year before. But it's still a movie that is primarily centered around fuzzy, scaly monsters. This is the movie that is the origin of their light diffusion effect that allowed them to make 3D surfaces look a little bit more like skin, a little bit more matte textured as opposed to the shininess that you see if you go back and look at the first Toy Story movie. I mean, the people's skin in the first Toy Story movie, that kind of just looked like giant toys. And knowing that and knowing what that horrifying dog looks like in the first Toy Story, I think a lot of people were terrified that this movie would look the same. Quite the contrary, this is one of the most beautiful movies I think I've ever seen to this day. Going back and rewatching this thing, I mean, it's wild. It's been 21 years and this thing still looks absolutely terrific. Yeah, we have a little bit better like lighting that we can do inside of an animated movie, but for the most part, I think it really benefits from the stylization of the characters themselves. They're very distinct. They have a very mid-century look to them, but then also the entire stylistic sense of the world fits into that mid-century aesthetic so well. This hit especially hard for me because at that time, without even knowing, I had started developing a real love for the 1960s aesthetics. I didn't know, it took me a long time. It took me until college to even figure out what graphic design was as opposed to art. And from that point forward, that's when I started being able to kind of articulate what I liked in terms of style and design. I had no language for that. I didn't even know anyone that I could talk to develop a language for that. All I knew was that when I saw this movie, I loved the art and something about the art felt like these other things I had started to love. I got into comics from a very young age. I was probably like 6 or 7. But for the first couple of years I was reading comics, I was pretty much just reading Sonic the Hedgehog. Didn't really get into superhero comics until I started picking up reprints of old Avengers issues. And the Avengers, as a team in the comics, comes from the 1960s. So those really lit my fuse in terms of the superhero storytelling, and the sensibilities, again, are all right there locked in on the 1960s. So I saw this thing and it was exciting to me and thrilling to me in basically every single way that a movie could be. I think to this day, it's up there in terms of my favorite animated movies. It's probably between this and Spirited Away, but rewatching this again, I mean, man, it's all there. This is a really cool one and it earns all the praise. One of the things that's so cool about it is that this is a movie that, by virtue of being a Disney movie, by virtue of being a Pixar movie, the assumption is always that these things are for children. And then we tend to celebrate animated movies that find a way to have more adult themes inside of them in a way that doesn't distract from the enjoyment for the kids, but does add substance for the adults. What's interesting about this is that I think they just focused on making a really good movie. The thing is, if you make a really good movie, if you make a really tight story, kids are gonna like it anyway. Now, I'm not talking about The Social Network. Like, there's no reason that you need to sit a 7-year-old down and be like, hey, check this out. The Winklevosses are about to get screwed. But this is something that, again, because it is so family focused, is relatable to them. And because it has superheroes in it, is automatically going to appeal to them on some level. Let's not mince words. This is a really bright and colorful movie. A lot of the stuff about this would telegraph that it is for kids. And let's also not mince words. Historically, superheroes and comic books were for children. Even though we've kind of reclaimed that as a thing with the MCU, for better or for worse, with people kind of refusing to grow up, myself very much included, it takes it from a perspective that is more similar to the way that cities and superheroes are portrayed in superhero cartoons that I grew up with, like the Batman animated series, more so than the more adult themes that we would get with something like Batman Begins or The Dark Knight. All that being the case, kids are being given a story that is relatable. I mean, this is a movie that depicts a family so incredibly realistically that it's willing to show parents who are pushing their kids to do things because they are trying to make up for their own lost glories. It's a movie that shows the squabbling in a realistic way and uses squabbling as a really funny way to introduce us to the powers that the kids have. A lot of this is kind of like a midlife crisis and like an ego movie for Mr. Incredible. It works for adults because they personally have probably lived it to some degree. There's this argument that he has with Helen that's really great. It's the one that I referenced earlier where she's saying, this isn't about you. This is about Dash. And he is trying to push Dash into a life that would work for him and that he wishes he had and was living instead of what Dash might actually want. That's really real. But it also works for kids because in a lot of cases, maybe they have seen their own parents having that argument. In writing this thing in such a true and honest way, it allows kids to connect to it. The whole thing feels really real. And despite the audience that it is actually being sold to, it's not really willing to play down to them. 20 minutes into the movie, Dash and Violet are fighting at the table. We get the introduction to their superpowers. And that whole table scene is punctuated by Frozone coming back. Frozone in particular is so well done that I always kind of forget that it's Samuel L. Jackson. Obviously, it's Samuel L. Jackson, but it is one of those things where, like, watching this movie again, I had moments listening to Frozone talking where it's like, Jesus, that is Samuel L. Jackson. Weirdly enough, I think like one of my favorite roles that he's ever played. And it sucks for his character that he's just trying to move on with his life. And here's Bob trying to pull him back into it. He's moved on. He's got a sick apartment. He's got a wife. He's looking great all the time. You know, he's moved on and he's happy about it. And Bob's just got to be there dragging him back. I got to be honest. I think I'm closer to Bob than a Frozone in most of my relationships with my friends. I think that's something we all have to address about ourselves when we hit our mid-30s. Are you leaning Bob or are you leaning Frozone? And then once you do that, talk to your therapist about it. Proceed accordingly. Make whatever changes you feel you might need to make. Let's keep the freewheeling nature of this conversation rolling with a couple fun facts about the movie. There's clearly a very steady hand at the wheel in terms of the storytelling. And I think for the most part, that steady hand is none other than Brad Bird. Brad Bird is a really fascinating guy. If you go through, I would recommend reading his Wikipedia page at the very least, because I have a couple facts about him here, but it's not going to get anywhere near all of the stuff there is to know about him. He's had a very interesting career and seems like one of the most respected kind of gig directors in Hollywood at the moment. So Brad does have a history with Disney. He started as an animator on a couple of Disney movies. Actually worked on The Fox and the Hound and The Black Cauldron, among a couple of others. He was always known for his visual storytelling ability. That storytelling ability is part of what got him hired onto The Simpsons, where he worked for the first 8 seasons. You might know those as the good seasons of The Simpsons. He also went on to direct Mission Impossible Ghost Protocol, which is a movie that I think is okay, but is inarguably pretty thrilling. I'm famously out on Mission Impossible movies overall, but as they go, gotta say, Ghost Protocol is in the top half for me. Coming into The Incredibles specifically, he was just coming off of The Iron Giant. Apparently, he'd had the idea earlier in his career, just as kind of a doodle about a superpowered family, but then he came back to it as his career was taking off because he'd been thinking a lot at the time about whether having a successful career in Hollywood came at the expense of a normal family life. This was something I saw on the Wikipedia page for this movie. Apparently, speaking of Spirited Away earlier in this pod, Hayao Miyazaki visited the set at one point and saw story reels. They asked him what he thought, and his quote through an interpreter was, "I think it's a very adventurous thing you're trying to do in an American film." Incredible burn. Absolutely incredible burn. Kind of a compliment. Also a burn, for sure. It reminds me of one that I heard about Pokemon. So when they were trying to figure out how to bring Pokemon over to an American audience after it had already been established and released in Japan, they had a meeting with some representatives from Nintendo of America, and the representatives from Nintendo of America were trying to tell the Pokemon developers that they wanted Pikachu to be less of a cute animal, more of a ferocious beast that had muscles. They were referring to, like biceps and pecs. Due to a mistranslation, the interpretation was that the Americans were trying to tell the Japanese people that Pikachu needed to be a fearsome tiger with boobs. If the multiverse is real, maybe someday we'll get that version of Pokemon. If you're out there and you're a developer of a video game, don't do it because that sounds cursed. It's I know you're thinking about it. Consider yourself the Oppenheimer of video game development and think long and hard before you want to drop that fucking bomb on the world. Speaking of dropping bombs on the world, let's talk about the villain. Syndrome is a really good villain. I've seen a lot of stuff online where people are trying to argue that Syndrome is right. He makes good points, but ultimately he was in it for the wrong reason. And that's kind of the crux of the philosophy of this entire movie. So it does rely on you going with The Incredibles on that journey. It is a very 1960s mentality. Obviously, he's right insofar the very Nietzsche thing of if everyone has a superpower, then no one has a superpower. Technically, he's wrong in that the superpowers are very different. You can see this in the X-Men. For every person, there's an incredible exchange in X-Men 3. They've announced that there's a cure for mutants, and Rogue is like, they can cure us. And then Storm comes through and she's like, no, they don't need to cure us. What we have isn't something that needs a cure. And it's like, all right, cool. So the girl who can't touch anything without killing it is really getting reassured by the literal god of weather right there. I think your powers might be a little different. So in a very technical basis, Syndrome, wrong on that one. But also, the reason that I say that he's in it for the wrong reasons is he's a perfect example of why not everybody should have access to really destructive power. If we ignore the specifics and we look at it just in terms of the general philosophy of what he's trying to say, this movie presupposes that the people with power tend to be people who share that sense of responsibility that you would want someone with these powers to have. It's a movie that actually believes in heroes. It's a movie that believes in the idea of the great man. This is a big overlap with the more recent Superman movie. I won't spoil anything if you haven't seen it yet. We may end up talking about this next week. That is a very optimistic movie. It takes place in an alternate universe that is a little bit more innocent than our own world. It's kind of like how in Ted Lasso, you can turn the microphone on any individual person and they will say something that's really emotionally vulnerable and is like a decent quip. It's not realistic. This is not how people really are. But it kind of does this to make an argument that there are people who can be trusted with this power and that people with this power don't necessarily need to be questioned the same way. Frankly, it's a little dangerous. The more I'm thinking about it, the more Syndrome might actually be right. But I think it's a twist. It's not necessarily that everyone inherently should have power. The power itself should be regulated. But obviously then that puts the onus on the regulators to be the people with the moral responsibility. So again, we kind of get back into that battle where it's like, who can be trusted? What we've been sold as the idea of the 60s now is this really idyllic, nostalgic version, right? When in reality, the 1960s were a time of massive political upheaval. You wouldn't have had the civil rights movement happening in the 1960s if it wasn't needed. Things weren't great for a lot of people back then. So we can't just look back on that time period with rose-colored glasses because it's just not realistic, and it discredits all of the actual work that was done to make a better world in the present, an imperfect world, but a better world. And so this kind of fake 1960s ideal, this nostalgic 1960s ideal, this more polished, sanitized version relies on the idea that at the end of the day, we can rely on people to do the right thing. Do I believe that now? I think on a grand scale, yes. I think it's one of those things where if you could somehow really reliably pull every single person on the planet, I do think that in general, kind of the wisdom of the crowd would sway in the direction of individual freedom and liberty and would vote against impinging upon any individual's rights. But it all really depends on where you're conducting that poll and who's included in it. I certainly think that there's a lot of places right now in the United States where same kind of a poll would be an extremely, extremely, extremely biased subset. So it's interesting looking at this movie as a refraction of how we live instead of a reflection of it. Is it something that we should dismiss as outright naive? Is it something that we should think about and should look up to and should hope to build a world that is more aligned with what is depicted here? Or is it something that we should just be glad we're talking about? And we got an animated movie that was served up as a family movie that genuinely has morals that are worth talking about in greater detail. You can't necessarily say the same thing about the Minecraft movie. I'm pretty sure. I've seen the first 20 minutes. It was better than I expected, but I doubt that it hits that same level of depth. For Syndrome specifically, there have been a lot of audience allegories over the years, but Syndrome does tend to represent a lot of toxic guys online. It's kind of funny to me now how well he represents the Snyder Cut crew. I don't know if you've been unfortunate enough to see, but there are a lot of people who were diehard fans of Zack Snyder's DC universe and the grimdark edginess of it that are rebelling that James Gunn dared to reboot it and replace Zack Snyder and create something that is a little bit more hopeful and a little bit brighter and a little bit lighter and a little bit more true. And I mean, these guys, they just celebrate seeing destruction on screen. You know, Man of Steel is a Superman movie that gets roasted because it has Superman toppling a bunch of buildings and snapping Zod's neck in front of a bunch of people. Not typically what you would think of in Superman, but they love it because they just like seeing that destruction. That's the same kind of misunderstanding of what's cool about superheroes that Syndrome, the character, has. Syndrome wants to fight bad guys. He wants to be looked up to by crowds. He doesn't want to do the actual work. And that is something that I think is cool. We've talked about before on the show that I'd love to see dove into more. What actually makes a superhero? Fighting a big eyeball in the middle of a city that's being destroyed, that's not necessarily super heroic, especially when the person's life isn't necessarily at risk. If they're the only person that can do that thing, one might argue it's more of a moral obligation than something to be looked up to, especially since in a lot of these movies, the villains are indirectly created by the heroes. I think what's interesting is like true heroics, sticking with someone that needs help, talking to someone like we brought this up in the Captain America episode. Sam Wilson reached out to Steve Rogers, not because he was famous, not because he was Captain America, but because he works with veterans and he could tell that Steve Rogers, a fellow veteran, might need some help. That is truly heroic. That is a small act that is realistic, that creates something that people viewing the movie can look up to and act on in their own day-to-day lives. That's what I'm more interested to see explored in some of these things than what we've seen previously. I'm interested in the fact that Syndrome got his fortune from being an arms dealer. I want to know how. I want to know how you go from being like a dejected little kid, just breaking into the arms dealing industry. Seems like maybe some sequel potential there. I also want to highlight, I don't feel like we as a society give enough love to Jason Lee. Dude was in My Name is Earl. Dude was in the Kevin Smith movies. But he was also a professional skateboarder before that. he popularized the 360 flip. It was invented by Rodney Mullen, but Jason Lee is the reason that all of us are doing 360 flips all the time. I did 3 today. I thank Jason Lee every single time. Well, okay. I'm out of breath, and I need a brief break from carrying the weight of this. I'm really feeling the absence of Tim in this moment. So I thought this might happen, and I had an idea for a segment that I hope you have as good a time listening to as I had, combing through and picking my favorites. I fed the transcripts of a couple of our old episodes through ChatGPT, and my goal was to create an AI version of Tim Keck. Now, Tim is known for having some takes on the show that are jarring and, really force you to think for a second about whether or not he's trolling before you come around to it and think, you know what? Maybe he's got a point on this one. So it took some work. I fed in the transcripts, and then I had to keep asking the AI to get more and more controversial. Nothing that it had the right level of controversy. Then I asked it to push the controversy to the bounds of good taste while keeping it as funny as possible. And that, listener, is when it turned into Tim. So here are a few of my favorites. Number 1, Dash should have died. It would have been a better movie. Now, is that true? I don't know. Would it have been interesting? Yes, absolutely. Maybe we get some more consequences for Mr. Incredible. Maybe it puts him in a point earlier in the movie where he realizes, oh no, I fucked up and it hurt my family. Number 2, Edna Mode is a war criminal. The argument for this one is that she was making all the superheroes' costumes, as far as we understand. And even though she knew that capes were bad, she has multiple instances where people were dying from these capes. Why did she keep putting capes on these costumes? Because she's a war criminal, of course. Number 3, Bob Parr is a domestic terrorist. He's the real villain of The Incredibles. On the more realistic side, I can definitely see Tim arguing this. I would assume that it's kind of him thinking that he caused all the problems at the beginning. He was continuously endangering his kids' lives. I do feel like I can hear him saying like, oh, what? So you learned to be a good dad after you dragged your kids on a dangerous adventure where they might have died? You know how else some other people learn to be a good dad? Read a book. Go to the library. Spend some time just go play catch. He's too focused on his old glory. He needs to let it go. This is his life now. And he needs to realize that the glory he has from those kids is better than any of the glories that he had from his superhero days. It's like he's here in the room with me. Here we go. This is a very plausible one. Elastigirl is the actual superhero in that marriage. She's doing all the work. It also tagged this onto it. I think this is interesting. Elastigirl and Mirage should have ended up together. Do I agree? No, that's a ridiculous thing to suggest. Is it interesting? Yes. Is it worth talking about? Maybe for the person working on that weird Pokemon mod that I talked about earlier. Final one. I'll end it on this. Jack should have been weaponized by the government. I hard agree on this one. We're getting to the end here. So the last things I'll share with you is just that the action sequences in this movie are genuinely some of the best superhero action we have ever gotten on film. It is breathtaking. One of the biggest things that stands out, and we have also talked about this on the pod before, is the physics of it. When you watch Spider-Man, you can feel how the webs hit things. You feel the weight when he's swinging on the web. You see the tension increase in the web itself. This movie does the same thing. You can feel the weight of the Omnidroids. You can feel how Frozone is sliding on the ice. Violet's force fields have an incredible tangibility to them. It's just amazing. And I think underpinning all of the action that they have with that degree of physics and realism is really what makes these things shine and sets it apart from other action sequences that just feel really flimsy. Obviously, all this stuff is super purposeful with animation. Everything is, God, animators will spend months working on literally a second or two of footage. So everybody is spending a lot of time paying attention to all these little details. And I think this movie is one of those movies where you really see that attention to details pay off. The setup with the Underminer is so cool. And I will say that I won't talk too much shit on The Incredibles 2, but I do think that the stuff with the Underminer and the battle against him is maybe one of the only like good parts in the second movie. And then I just want to say one more time that the graphic design stood out. I think between the physics and the design of the entire world, it's a perfect argument for why you should use animation as a medium to convey an idea. It feels so cohesive. Like I said, the ethos fits with the mid-century look, and it's this incredible, incredible piece. It feels like a piece of art in and of itself. One of the common criticisms of Marvel is if there's so much CGI, why not go all the way? I mean, my God, there are absolutely Marvel movies. There's 600 Marvel movies at this point. There are absolutely Marvel movies that I think would have really benefited from just being a full-blown CGI movie instead. I mean, Spider-Verse is another one where it's like you just can't do it to the same degree in live action that you can do there. And it's fun. It makes me sad that people view animation as something that's just for kids, because this is a great example of something that is animated but doesn't need to be just for kids. The themes and the values in this movie are relatable to everyone and valuable to everyone. And quite frankly, we need more movies like The Incredibles. And we certainly need more Fantastic Four movies like The Incredibles. So with all that, I, like you, am excited to see the new Fantastic Four movie tonight. We will be back here next week, probably either talking about that or the new Superman movie. So, go to the movies this weekend. Superman was good. I'll spoil that. It's a good time. Go check it out. I'll see you back here next week. Thank you very much for listening. Stay nerdy, everybody. Bye.